Welcome everybody back to another Health Mastery Show episode. Today I have on with me Dr. Bill Campbell. So Bill is one of the leading physique scientists. He's the professor of exercise science and director of the Performance and Physique Enhancement Lab at the University of South Florida. He has published over 200 papers and is a published author as well. And in today's episode we get into flexible versus rigid dieting and some of the research that Bill has done in his lab along with some of his graduate students, and looking at body assessment or body composition outcomes. We also talk a little bit about the first refeed study in resistance trained athletes. So do refeeds actually help with muscle retention or any other outcomes that will lead to a better physique? If you want to support the podcast, please do leave a rating and review. Take 10-20 seconds to leave a rating. It really helps with the algorithm and getting it out there, and it's completely free, obviously. If you want a free natural bodybuilding course help you get into the best shape possible with tons of free resources, downloads, training plans, nutrition and guidance and advice, click the link in the show notes. You'll get that for absolutely free. And if you are interested in working directly with me to maximize your potential and get in the best shape possible and fast track those results, you can also check that out in the show notes. But without further ado, let's get into this episode with Dr. Bill Campbell. Bill, thanks so much for coming on, man.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I've been following your work for a long time now, and recently, actually, I just thought about it. Hold on, I'm fixing my camera for those watching. Just trying to get it. Recently, I actually bought one of your books. I don't know. I'm not sure if it's a new book, but the NSCA Guide to Sport and Exercise Nutrition.
Yeah, hold it up for a second. Let me see. I think that's the first edition, and I think there's now a second edition.
Oh, right. Yeah, I'm not sure what edition this is, but yeah, I was reading it, and it's good. It's interesting. I think that the good thing about that book is that it kind of boils it down and makes it quite easy to understand, because I've got some nutrition books there that are impossible to understand, some of the stuff in it. They're all mechanisms and pathways and things like that, which is good, but it's not very practical, right?
Yeah, that book was definitely meant to serve the practitioner and to help them with actual things that they can actually implement without understanding all of the complex pathways.
Yeah. So, but before we kind of get into this podcast, it would be great if you could kind of introduce yourself and kind of who you are, what you do, etc., and your background.
Sure. Yeah. So, Bill Campbell's the name. I am a professor of exercise science at the University of South Florida, which is in Tampa, Florida. I direct the Performance and Physique Enhancement Laboratory there. And my lab has two main focuses. One is sports nutrition. The other is physique enhancement. And probably for the last 5 years, we've been very focused on physique enhancement, which is really helping people with dieting, helping them to lose as much fat as possible, but also investigating the manners in which we can maintain or even possibly increase muscle mass when dieting. So we look at different types of diets, we look at different types of training programs, and in some cases, dietary supplements. So that's kind of my research background.
That's really interesting. I think I may have heard it on a podcast before, but you said you funded a lot of this yourself, right? So I'd been looking at PhDs for the last while, and everything's in oncology or public health, if you're lucky, in nutrition. Good luck trying to get a research in physique enhancement, especially for people who already lift weights and aren't, obese or have sarcopenia or something like that. So yeah, it's like a dream kind of lab that you have. I guess that was something that you envisaged one day rather than you just fell into it, right?
Yes, yeah. My dream was to actually run the lab that I'm running, and you're right. There's very little funding, so I've been very, very blessed. Dymatize Nutrition in years past has given me some funding to do some of this research. Legion Athletics has currently given me some money to keep the lab functional and going, especially in a COVID environment. But yeah, I rely on a lot of volunteers. My master's students and my undergrad students really run the lab, and Yeah, nobody's getting paid. I'm not getting rich off of it for sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And the kind of studies that you run, would they typically be on resistance trained athletes, or would that be looking at like a population health kind of dietary lifestyle choices and things like that that would have greater impact, but maybe less of an interest to what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, most of our research is on resistance trained males and females, and I actually do probably a little more female specific research than most labs. I say that we are currently doing a study in non-resistance trained females. And what essentially, if you try to look at all of the bodybuilding research that's done, there's almost none, and there's a reason for that. It's because bodybuilders won't let you change their diets and training that you would need to do in a study. So while my research doesn't necessarily investigate bodybuilders, I believe it's the closest thing that you're going to get to a bodybuilding study where there's an actual intervention, because they're lean people generally and they're resistance training. And we do have some research in bodybuilders, but those are mostly around case studies and case studies and case series studies where we looked at 4, 5, or 6 bodybuilders, just kind of following them to do what they do.
Yeah, there's some case studies, and then it's mainly like qualitative research.
Yes.
You know, what the bodybuilders do, and I think Andrew Chappelle has done some, or Chappell, I think he pronounces it, has looked at bodybuilding diets, and I think in even some years you cited the Rousseau paper, which is pretty famous. I think Peter Fishin has done a few like that, but yeah, I think like as a competitive bodybuilder myself, you know, there's not a hope you'd get somebody doing my diet, especially if I didn't think it was optimal, and it wouldn't. If someone told me you're going to be in either this group or a control, or a group that potentially may get you worse outcomes, like there's not a chance I'm going to diet down for that and then come in at, like, if I'm not coming in at 4% body fat, you know, I'm not doing it. So
exactly. And even then, if you did get some bodybuilders, you got to get 20, 30, 40 to have a large enough sample size to even have enough power to detect a significant difference if one exists. So it's and I live in a city where it's very favorable for bodybuilding. There's a lot of bodybuilding in my city, and again, I've tried.
What city are you in?
It just hasn't worked out to get actual competitive bodybuilders.
Well, what city are you based in?
Tampa, Florida.
Okay, so no, the Olympia is in Orlando.
Yeah,
right?
But it's close. It's only about 90 minutes from me.
Okay, yeah, it'd be super interesting to do studies on those kind of guys.
Ooh, yeah.
But yeah, I know that you wouldn't even get that past an ethics board, because these guys have special supplements and stuff like that. So I think Brazil, they do some studies right on assisted bodybuilders, because maybe it's illegal. I don't really know, or maybe it's legal, I should say.
As long as we wouldn't be providing them, I think it would be fine if you're just monitoring what they do.
That's another, though, massive confounder, right? Though, if somebody's like using a TRT dose of testosterone and dieting down, then you have another guy who's doing the same longitudinal study, but they're using like 2 grams of various different substances. It's hard to say, well, it's because they're eating a lower carb diet, they got different results.
Yeah,
like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But today I wanted to chat a little bit about a paper that you were a co-author on with one of your master's students, your graduate students, around flexible dieting versus rigid dieting, and the outcomes that showed. Would you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. And before we get into it, I just want to acknowledge Lauren Conlon. She was my master's student at the time. So that was a study that she designed, she coordinated and ran the whole thing. I just advised, but that was really her brainchild. She did a really good job. And that was the first dieting study we had actually did in my lab.
Oh, wow. Interesting, yeah. So I know that you used the term that, I'm not sure if this term has actually been used in a paper before, is if it fits your macros. I know that came from, I think, the bodybuilding.com forums. I'm not sure if it was Alan Aragon who actually coined it, but I know that somebody had posted or applied. I think the story is somebody kept asking could they eat cheese, and then various things that weren't sure if they were clean or unclean foods. So because cheese is kind of in the middle, I guess, depending on the type of cheese. So then somebody kept replying like, you can eat it if it fits your macros, and then it became this acronym IIFYM. So and then I guess clean eating, which your typical kind of bro foods or unprocessed foods. And would you mind going a little bit into kind of what you were trying to compare and how those diets were different?
Yeah, so the first thing is the subjects that we recruited. So the subjects were resistance trained, and I don't remember the definition that we used. It was probably 1 or 2 years of consistent resistance training. It was also one of, I think, the only study at this time that we didn't have them resistance train in my lab, so they were unsupervised as they did their workout. So that would be a limitation of that study. Since that time, we've had all of our subjects supervised in our research studies. In addition to that, we set it up for basically asking 2 questions. We had a 10-week diet phase, and we wanted to ask the question, what happens with flexible dieting, meaning you get to choose your foods, versus a meal plan where most of your foods are given to you, but they're both dieting at the same rate? Is there a better effect for one or the other? So that was the main question. And then there was a 10-week post-diet phase where we told the subjects they could eat whatever they wanted. If they were currently dieting, they could continue to diet, or they could not diet any longer. If they were tracking their macros, they could stop, or if they weren't tracking their macros, they could start. So it was very open to what they wanted to do. So in total, it was a 20-week study under 2 phases, a diet phase and then the post-diet phase. And the groups were separated by the independent variable of how they went on their diet. So the flexible dieting group, we just told them, here's your macros. You have to eat at a 25% caloric restriction, but you choose the foods you want, with the only restriction being, or the only instruction, you have to get 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. The other group, we said, you don't get to choose your foods. We're going to give you a very modified list of foods, or a short list of foods that you can choose from. So it wasn't like they had to eat the same thing for 10 weeks, but they were given a few choices, but they weren't allowed to deviate from this meal plan. And we also told them, eat 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass. And after 10 weeks of dieting, they both lost approximately the same amount of fat and the same amount of muscle mass that was maintained. So there really there was no significant differences in the approach that they used during their diet to lose a significant amount of fat loss. So the main question of our study was, we can answer, it doesn't matter if you follow a meal plan or if you do flexible dieting, or as some people like to liberally call it, if it fits your macros. As long as you're in a caloric deficit, you will maintain, you'll be successful in your fat loss goal.
I'm looking at a sample meal menu plan here, and has your typical foods of meal 1, eggs plus egg whites, avocado, spinach, plus 1 whole wheat toast. Meal 2, chicken breast, sweet potato, broccoli, almonds. Meal 3, Greek yogurt, peanut butter, mixed berries. And meal 4 is ground beef, lettuce, and brown rice. So typical clean eating meal. So it's very interesting. Did you capture any data on what if it fits your macros group were eating? Were they actually following a well balanced diet, or were they eating like Pop-Tarts and ice cream and whey protein?
No, we didn't capture the types of foods they were eating. I mean, within reason, I think it was a 3-day food record at the beginning of the study and the end of the study, but we didn't report any of the specific foods. So in that group, it was mainly just their macros. So that would be another limitation. We don't know exactly what kind of foods that they took.
So was this something that you were expecting to find initially? I guess because you've had a lot of anecdotal experience or, with clients and stuff like that over the years. So you're probably almost confirming something that you knew, right? Or were you expecting that one would be better than the other?
I think by the time we ran the study, at least in my mind, I kind of thought there wouldn't be a difference. But I'll tell you, early on, I don't know what year, but early in the flexible dieting introduction, I thought that if you don't eat specific foods, or if you eat, what some people would call unhealthy or junk foods, that you wouldn't lose as much weight. And over time, and I have a PhD in nutrition, and I still thought that at the time. So it's kind of interesting thinking back now, like, well, why would I thought that if the caloric deficits are the same? But I did, so this study didn't surprise me at the time, but had this study been done 2 or 3 years prior, I think it would have caught me by a little bit more by surprise.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and again, it will really come down, I think, to depending on how those who are following the if it fits your macros restructuring their diet, because that's obviously a very broad term, right? So somebody can really, quote unquote, take the piss, where they'll eat just junk food, and I do know people who just eat junk food, but they hit their macros and they hit their protein, but they're not eating fruits and vegetables. And there definitely was a paper that I read where people were I think they were competing for a show or getting ready for a show, and they were comparing a rigid versus flexible approach, and if people didn't have enough food choices, they were actually deficient in some certain micronutrients, which of course, as you know, can be coenzymes or cofactors for energy production, like B vitamins. Probably not a huge issue with people eating a lot of protein, but these things could perhaps affect energy and energy output, and indirectly affect calorie balance, and just there's so many different things that happen in the body and physiological processes that it's they may have an impact. But I think often people will think that I follow a healthy approach, or else I'm following, or if it's not healthy, then it's bad, rather than saying, okay, well, there's many shades of gray, and I can still have a good diet and still eat a cupcake or a donut if it fits my macros, rather than saying, well, because I'm following this approach means that I just fit it with as much junk food as I possibly can.
Yeah, I agree. It's and now I don't think anybody in our space really questions the outcome of the study. I don't think anybody's surprised by it. It would have been great if we published that in like 2014.
And what are your thoughts then on, because if you do follow it and if it fits your macros approach, every time you do, let's say, and I know it's not dichotomous, because you can follow an if it fits your macros approach and still eat quote unquote clean, and many people now have caught on to that idea of eating clean. Technically, right, both of them were kind of following a macro approach, but things like phytonutrients and flavonoids and phytochemicals, all of these things, maybe this isn't something that it's in your area of expertise, but do you think that any of these have impacts on perhaps body composition outcomes? And we know long term, like things like anthocyanins, etc., can have impacts on cognitive function in elderly people, and this is probably like very low impact over a very long time, or like over a lifetime, rather than saying, okay, 12 weeks I'm gonna eat blueberries and I'm gonna have like a super brain. But do you think that these do have an impact on body composition at all? So any of these benefits that are not necessarily essential, like they're not micronutrients or vitamins, but they have these other properties that are in plants or other foods, could they have an impact on body comp?
In the recreational athlete, I don't think you're going to see I don't think you would see much of an impact in the short term, as you're saying. So, as an example, and these are just my thoughts, and I could be wrong. 2 different people go on a 12-week diet. One eats as much junk food as they can. The other person eats as much health food as they can, but protein's the same, the caloric deficit's the same, and these people are not shredded. I don't think you're going to see much of a difference in that for physique in that initial time frame. And, you know, going from, let's say, 16% body fat to 12% body fat. I do think health markers, especially over time from a highly processed diet versus a whole food diet, I think you are going to start to see some things manifest. And then over time, if you're not healthy, it's going to be harder to lose body fat, even in a caloric deficit. If you have health problems, your motivation to train might not be as high. So I do think there could be a lot of intangible elements to a highly processed diet over time, but not in the short term. And again, and I could be wrong.
Yeah, I almost wish as a coach that helps with the people that it did have an impact, because people don't get this instantaneous, this instant gratification from eating good quality foods, like fruits and vegetables. Like you said, it may not impact your physique, but it definitely does long term. And if you're following a junk food diet approach, it doesn't give you the habits that you need to have a healthy diet long term, because not everyone's going to track their macros, until the day they die. So it is a good idea to be trying to get these foods into your diet. And one thing I wanted to ask, sorry, go ahead.
Just add one thing. There is research on highly processed foods and just how little they impact hunger, or how little they make you feel fuller. So there was a famous study by, I think it was Kevin Hall, in a metabolic ward study, and it was a big difference from a highly processed to a more whole foods diet. So just the process of dieting, if you're going to rely on what, again, we'll just use the term junk foods, yes, you may be able to lose the same amount of fat in the short term, but you're probably going to suffer a lot more in the process, because you're not going to feel as full. That those foods aren't going to help with your hunger as much. So there is that, what I would say, a very practical consequence of choosing wholesome foods versus highly processed foods in your diet.
Yeah. I mean, when I'm coaching people to do natural bodybuilding shows, I always tell them, you're going to have to like fruits and vegetables, because when you're eating 1,600 calories, you're not eating Snickers bars. I know they can fit in your macros, but you don't want to be starving because you won't be able to sleep or train.
Yeah.
So fruits and vegetables, not because they're healthy or good for you, but because they're high in food volume, high in water, high in fiber, and they don't have much calories. But yeah, the Kevin Hall one is very interesting. And one thing that kind of was interesting to me that I wanted to ask was, it doesn't change the calorie balance equation per se, but with highly processed foods, we can almost extract more calories perhaps from them, because I know there was a few papers, and I can't remember the names, where they're looking at peanut butter versus whole nuts, the same calories from both, but the body was able to absorb more calories from the peanut butter, essentially because it was already pre-digested.
Oh, okay.
I can send you that paper after, but it's very interesting. So it was actually used in favor of peanut butter for endurance athletes, because if you're running the Marathon des Sables in Morocco, and you can't eat 15,000 calories a day, you don't want to be excreting calories that you've consumed, because it goes through your GI tract, etc. So so little things like that. That's why I'm kind of surprised almost that there wasn't a little bit of a difference, because the the unprocessed foods, they're not as refined, so you can't maybe perhaps extract as much calories from them, because more passes through intact almost, to be visual. Another thing that was interesting was at the end of the paper that you looked at, there was a period where you looked at post dieting phase. Would you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that was the other part of the study. So in the 10 weeks that followed, as I mentioned earlier, the subjects could eat whatever they wanted. We just asked that they continued working out and show up for post-testing. And what we found was both groups gained weight in the post-diet period, but the group that was assigned or randomly assigned to the flexible dieting group during the first 10 weeks of the study, they actually gained a significantly greater amount of fat-free mass, which it's not all muscle mass, but a component of fat-free mass is muscle mass. So we assume muscle mass. So I'll just use that term. They gained a significantly a greater amount of fat-free mass or muscle mass in the post-diet period. Now, does that mean that flexible dieting is somehow more anabolic after the diet period? Because that's what our data showed. And I'm careful not to make that assumption, even though our data showed it. The reality is, nor Lauren, the coordinator, we don't know why that happened. Now, of course, we're obligated to theorize why it happened since our data showed that. And one of the things that we theorized, and again, I think we're reaching here, but there's data on people who have higher amounts of stress that they do not adapt as well to resistance training program. So we hypothesized that people who had to keep eating the same amount of foods when they didn't have choices, did that cause greater amounts of physiological stress that limited their adaptation after the diet? Again, we don't know because we didn't measure stress levels.
Yeah.
But it was at least something we could say, here's a possible reason.
Yeah, I think I was definitely reading something about, I think it was some of the authors that you'd cited in that paper, Bartholomew
that was
and
the study.
Stoltz, they have a few on stress. One of them was actually, and just reading here, psychological stress impairs short-term muscular recovery from a resistance training, and it was students doing before their exams.
Yep.
It took them like twice as long to recover from the same workouts. So, it's interesting that, maybe you have to do less volume or they're overreaching essentially then if they're doing the same amount of volume. But I'd say you're probably scratching your head at the end of that paper trying to figure out, like, how do they gain more muscle, and trying to come up with that.
Yeah.
Does flexible dieting lead people to go and take anabolic steroids or something?
Yeah. Well, we hope not, because that would have really skewed the data. But yeah, I think the conclusion that I'm comfortable with that study is whether you choose a meal plan or flexible dieting, you will lose equivalent amounts of body fat. Other than that, even though our data suggested, but the other thing is, it wasn't like they were continuing to flexible diet in the post-diet phase. So it's even then, just anything to explain that is kind of just purely theoretical.
What kind of measurements? What kind of instruments were you using to measure body composition? Was it ultrasound?
Yeah.
Or BIA?
In that study, it was ultrasound, and unfortunately, at the time, I didn't have a device to measure body water, so possibly there's another limitation. Possibly, a large portion of those gains in fat-free mass were due to body water retention. Since that time, I now have a very valid device to measure that. So we use that in all of our studies now. But at that time, I didn't have that.
Yeah. So if you match the ultrasound with like a BIS or something, you get the 4-compartment model. It could have been maybe, I would be surprised, but maybe they ate more sodium or something like that. But it'd be surprising because they probably, if they were following a flexible approach, they probably kept it pretty same. But that's definitely interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing that I quickly want to touch on, and I've kind of reiterated this or made some content about this numerous times, and I think this is probably one of the pioneer studies again in the resistance training space, was your research on refeeds, and you compared, I believe it was 5 days. It was the kind of isocaloric diets, or sorry, they were matched diets. They're both in calorie deficit, but both groups are in the same percentage calorie deficit. But one had a larger deficit on 5 days and a refeed in the weekend. The others just had a consistent calorie deficit across the 7 days. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
What I'm saying there.
Yeah. Both.
Yeah, okay.
I'll phrase it like this: both had an average weekly caloric deficit of 25%.
Yeah.
One of the groups just did a simple 25% caloric restriction every day. The other group did a 35% reduction Monday through Friday, and then on Saturday and Sunday they went up to 100% of their maintenance calories. And when you average that out, it equaled a 25% caloric restriction.
And the chain and those refeed days, they were just basically increases in carbohydrates, protein and fat remain constant, right?
Correct. That was what we instructed them, and that's what they tracked all of their macros. So we were able to confirm that that's what they did.
And what were the results of this research?
So that was a diet only study, and that was a 7-week intervention. And both groups lost a significant amount of body fat. The differences were the group doing the diet refeeds, or the ones that were increasing their calories on the weekends, which, by the way, that's what most people do naturally. So I think it's great to actually design a diet that fits what people naturally do. That was part of the motivation for doing this study. But what happened in that group was they were able to maintain their dry fat-free mass significantly better, and they were able to maintain their resting metabolic rate better. And when I say better than the group that never took a break, or better than the group that didn't increase their calories on the weekends. So both groups did lose some fat-free mass. Both groups did have a suppression of metabolic rate, but it was less in the group that was doing the refeeds. And in that study, we did account for body water. That was very important that you do it in that kind of study, because when you're dealing with weight loss and carb manipulations, you have to account for glycogen and the water retention that happens with increased glycogen levels. So that was one of the main caveats, was let's account for any glycogen. And we did that by doing a measure where we accounted for the body water, and then that left dry fat-free mass. And that's mostly protein. I mean, by definition, that's just protein and mineral content that's in the body. And that was significantly retained in the group that increased their calories on the weekend. And one other thing about that, the metabolic rate actually confirms that they likely maintain more muscle, because metabolism is a proxy for muscle mass. So the number one predictor of your resting metabolic rate is your lean body mass, or your fat-free mass. So if you're going to have a higher amount of muscle mass, you would anticipate a higher resting metabolic rate. And we had that in the study. So both of those measures, one was more direct with the ultrasound and the dry fat-free mass compartment, but the resting metabolic rate data also kind of confirmed that they maintained their dry fat-free mass better.
How did you measure dry fat-free mass? Is that biopsy or?
No. So that's simply, it's a 2-compartment model. So ultrasound tells us how much fat they have. And then from that, we know how much fat-free mass they have. Then we used bioelectrical impedance. We had an in-body 570. That tells us how much body water they have. And then you just subtract that out, and that leaves your fat-free mass minus the water. That leaves something, a term that Siri, I forget the first name of that author, but the famous body composition researcher, the term that he used to describe that was dry fat-free mass. And that's really just protein, which is your contractile tissue mainly, and mineral content.
So when you combine those two methods, that then becomes a 4-compartment model, right?
I believe it's a 3-compartment model. If we had DEXA and then we measured bone mineral content, then we would have had a 4-compartment model.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, that's really interesting. And just curious, how come you didn't use the ultrasound and the BIS for the flexible versus the rigid dieting? Was it a different lab, or
no? We did use the ultrasound for our 2-compartment model. So we used the ultrasound for fat mass and fat-free mass. I just didn't have the BIA to account for the total body water. So we that study published with a 2-compartment model.
And did you do any psychological measurements of like people's mood or how they felt when they were doing the refeed versus non-refeed?
I'm trying to remember. I don't think we did mood. We didn't do a profile of mood states. We may have done a 3-factor eating questionnaire in that study, but I don't. If we did, I don't think there was any differences between the two groups.
Because if you talk to any bodybuilder that's doing a diet for, like in natural bodybuilding especially, you're recommended that you diet for at least 20 weeks, depending on how much fat you have, but probably even more. And you know, telling somebody that you're going to be in a deficit for 6 months straight,
That's right.
You know, good luck. Versus, okay, we're going to push for Monday to Friday, you know, because like you said, most people still have normal lives, so the weekend's a bit more social or something. But on the weekend, we're going to have a bit more carbs. You know, they can dig for, you know, they can push on Thursday and Friday if they know, okay, Saturday I'm going to get a big refeed now and I can eat more carbs and I'm looking forward to that, and then, you know, start again, rather than saying, okay, I'm 20 weeks out, so I'm just going to diet for 20 weeks. It's a lot more difficult. So I think that's probably one of the major benefits, is even if there was no difference in muscle retention, it's the psychological benefit. And even in your kind of general population, I think having a refeed, I know people tend to want to have cheat days or cheat meals, but having a light at the end of the tunnel, it's a little bit more sustainable.
Yeah. And I can appreciate the psychological for myself. Like I've done bodybuilding at, one show in my past, but I do diets a lot just because I experiment. And just the idea of, I get to increase my calories, man, that's such a relief, and it's so enjoyable. Now, whether or not any psychological assessments can pick that up, I don't know. I'm not an exercise psychologist. But at least in my own intuitive mind, it's very exciting, rewarding, whatever the term would be.
Yeah. You mentioned something about diet breaks before we start recording. How does a diet break differ from a refeed? And, you know, is there any benefits to doing diet breaks? I think Jackson Pios down in Australia is doing some research on that. But what are your thoughts on diet breaks?
Yeah, so to me, a diet refeed, and we actually coined some definitions for this in a recent narrative review in the Strength and Conditioning Journal. But refeed, think of that as a few days of increased calories, maybe up to 2 or 3 days. And then a diet break, that's usually defined in weeks of taking a complete break from your diet, where you're eating at maintenance or even above maintenance for a week. So it's just a time difference. And one thing that I've learned, and we've just completed we're about to submit our revisions for a diet break study that we did in my lab in resistance trained females. And as we look at that data, and basically what we found was very similar to what the Payos paper that you just mentioned was. There wasn't any physiological benefits to the diet breaks. There was an improvement in one of the eating inventory questionnaires, or one of the variables called disinhibition, which is taking the diet breaks allowed the subjects to not have a tendency, a subjective desire to overeat. So it helped with that aspect. And that's important. And I believe the Payos paper found the same thing. So that seems to be the benefit, at least in lean people, of diet breaks. But my two thoughts on diet breaks are, I think a lot of people are, well, let me go there second. The only way a diet break works, or at least when you look at the literature, when they have worked, it's been when people have had a negative adaptation or a negative consequence to their diet. So think of situations where the diets are very long duration, like you said, 20 weeks, 26 weeks. And that's exactly what natural bodybuilders do. Or what if the caloric deficit is fairly severe? So when you have those situations where you're going to start to have a suppressed metabolism, or you're going to start to have weight loss plateaus, or you start to lose lean body mass, once those things are introduced, that's where the utility of a diet break is helpful. So in the Payos study and in our own recent research, we didn't find a benefit, an overt benefit for diet breaks. But if you look at the amount of fat loss or the length of the studies or the severity of the caloric deficits, the diets didn't induce a negative consequence or a negative physiological outcome. So you're trying to put something that is supposed to, quote unquote, fix a diet when nothing's broke. So I think the utility for a diet break, if it is going to be effective, it needs to be in a situation where either the severity of the caloric deficit is high or the duration of the diet is very long. Without those two things, I don't think you can expect diet breaks to do anything. The second conclusion that I have is I think a lot of people will look at the PAO study or our study, which is going to be published hopefully within the next few months, and they'll just say, yep, these are worthless, like they're not helpful. And I think that's a very short-sighted view of them. They didn't cause weight gain, so there's no harm from a diet break. And as we just mentioned, if you're just tired of dieting and you want to take a break, the research would suggest you can do that without guilt and without a fat regain. So I think it's a beautiful approach. Now, maybe for competitive bodybuilders, that's a whole different issue. But if you're a recreational lifter and you're trying to live kind of like a lean lifestyle and you want to go on vacation for a week, or you want to go to a birthday party and just take some time off, do that with no harm. Obviously, bodybuilders have a show date, so they may or may not have the luxury of implementing a diet break. So those are kind of my thoughts after completing our study, or at least where my mind is at currently on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, to circle back to some of the stuff you said about stress earlier, I think if you're dieting for 6 months, there's going to be a period where there's going to be stress, whether it's gyms being closed because of COVID or you getting COVID. And, the show date might still be there. So, it's perfect time for a diet break and things like that. And then also, even with the people who just want to live a lean lifestyle, I think you got to be able to diet or to live a lifestyle where you're not just white knuckling and you're just, I'm going to get there. So it teaches you patience and teaches you how to deal with normal life, because we've all seen people who've, dropped a ton of weight by eating, meal replacements, and then they go back to eating normal and they just put all the weight back on. It's like you want to be able to, have periods where you're not actually making progress, or, at least maintaining progress, and seeing how you fare with your habits and your lifestyle. So I think that's very interesting. And final question for you, Bill, was just in the light of the Olympia coming up this weekend. I really am a fan of like just bodybuilding, even just open body, untested body, whatever you want to call it. Like I'm watching some of the videos of like the competitors, and a lot of them seem to like have very bro style diets. Like they will cut out sweeteners, they will follow very specific meal plans. Very rarely you'll see them eating something that's not considered a kind of a clean traditional bodybuilding food. Do you think there's any kind of reason behind that, or why perhaps they would do, maybe it's not a scientific reason, but maybe psychological reasons that they're trying to follow something like that, or do you think perhaps there is benefit to doing something like that in those scenarios?
I think for the general person going on diets, it's not important. I think, again, if you take me, my body fat right now is probably around 18%, maybe 17, and I want to go from 18 to 14. Doesn't matter what I eat, as long as I'm in a caloric deficit. I think where it could potentially start to make more of a difference is as you get leaner and more elite, like the people that you're probably referring to. And I'm not saying it does, but I think it's much more likely that it could. In terms of why they may do that, it's probably just based on that's what they've always done. That's what the last winner has done, and the winner before that, and the winner before that. And then I can appreciate, like you're saying earlier, once your calories get to low enough of a point, you don't really you lose the freedom to even do a flexible dieting approach. There's only so many foods that will fit. So I think by default you're kind of forced into a certain types of foods that your body digests well. And again, the foods that we're talking about are probably fairly, the types of foods that don't cause a lot of problems in a lot of people. So those are my general thoughts on it.
The only other things I could kind of think of would be that if you're very consistent with your food choices, there won't be that variance in calories that the companies are legally allowed to have, right? So that
Yeah.
20% variance. That's one of the things, I guess. If you're always eating white potatoes and it's USDA, my fitness pal, it's a white potato is going to be a white potato. I know I said the final question, but to wrap up, if you had like as much money as possible in the world, what kind of research would you like to see in this field? Like, what would you like to do if you had all the equipment, and like what's not being done that you would really like to do?
Yeah, I think I would probably, if I had, a couple $100,000, would be to do a metabolic ward study, very similar to what I do now. So give them access to a weight room, but just monitor every gram of food that goes into the bodies. That way there's no variability in what they track or what they're estimating. So just so we could be more precise on caloric deficits. Something that's very interesting to me now is the concept of concurrent training. So you have this bodybuilding lifestyle. How much do you need to fear additional aerobic activity in losing muscle mass? So obviously your main goal is to build muscle mass, but you also want to be lean. The two best ways to do that are caloric deficits and added aerobic exercise. So that's something that I would also want to explore further.
And just track everything, like hormones, everything. Would it be track everything, or would it be specific? Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I'm actually just about to go play basketball, so I know I won't be training legs tomorrow. So hopefully I don't lose too much size in them.
Well, I don't think you will.
So where can people find more about you and your work?
Yeah, the only place that I'm really active on social media is Instagram. So if you can follow my Instagram, it's at Bill Campbell, PhD. And I put a lot of education stuff on there. I talk about my research. And if you like sports nutrition and you like bodybuilding and you just like losing fat, then that's everything that I put out there. It's fat loss, building muscle, and sports nutrition types things.
Awesome. I'll link that down below, and I'll link the papers that we talked about, because I'm pretty sure both of them are open access as well.
Yes, yep, they both are.
Awesome. All right. Great to have you on, Bill. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you very much.